Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast. I'm Scott, and joining me this week, the illusion of justice to me just being disillusioned. It's Brian. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Scott, it's great to be back. Good to see you and excited to talk about these two great shows.
I am excited to be back, both just recording a podcast in general, and especially recording with you. Last time we got together, I believe, was right around the holidays back in December. So it's been a little while. But on our agenda for how many years now? We were always saying, when Perry Mason comes back, we're going to do that season, because I feel in many ways, when we recorded our podcast for season 1 of Perry Mason, I personally feel it was kind of a turning point for the podcast altogether. Number one, I made a lot of audio improvements during that season, and I just changed the way I went about things and the way the podcast goes about things. So I am fond of the show just because I feel it kind of raised the level of our podcasting, and also the chance to talk about a show about a lawyer with a lawyer. I know Better Call Saul, but we weren't watching Better Call Saul for that. We all know that.
Yeah, I think, as I recall that time fondly, I think that was one of really the first times that you and I sort of ventured off on our own and just did sort of a Scot and Brian thing. And because I'd been doing Better Call Saul and stuff like that, and you and I'd done Legion, which went away, and The Americans, but to be dedicated to a show from its inception and start with that show and follow it through a whole first season, that was sort of a new thing. And we both found it, it came out of nowhere. We really didn't know much about it, and really enjoyed the first season and looking forward to doing this season.
Yeah, right. Because we are here to kick off our podcasting coverage of Perry Mason season 2. And as you kind of alluded to in the introduction, should let everyone know they need to stick around, because after we finish chatting about the most cynical lawyer since Frank Galvin, by the way, is that too obscure a reference? Okay. Frank Galvin out there, just Google it, and then you can add a great movie to your queue. Anyway, beyond our musings about Mason here, this week we are also going to talk about a series that just today, and by today I mean Thursday, March 9th, that just today completed its first season. And it's a series I've been jonesing to talk about for the longest time, and I'm talking about the Peacock series Poker Face. But first things first. And on this podcast, at least for the next few weeks, hint, hint, the first series we're going to be discussing is Perry Mason. And we're going to be talking about the season premiere, also known as Chapter 9. Now, I like that we kind of picked up pretty quickly that it picks up several months after season 1 left off. And one of the things I thought was very well laid out pretty much throughout the entire premiere, not just the very opening scenes, was the way they were painting a fairly quick picture of where our 3 principal characters are in their respective life journeys on the series. And by the 3, obviously, I'm referring to Della Street, Paul Drake, and of course, Perry Mason himself. So ladies first, let's start off with Della Street, because when we see her again, we know within a minute she's asserting her position. She's reminding the older viewers that perhaps, once again, this isn't the Della Street of the books and TV series you remember from years past. She is not a secretary. In fact, she's hired a secretary. She, at this point, it becomes clear she is the glue and business-minded person at the law practice. But as we also see her almost accidentally voice an objection in court in a later scene, it's a reminder of where a woman stood in terms of the law profession back in the 1930s. And of course, between her encounter with another woman, this mildly mysterious woman with the nearly over-the-top name of Anita St. Pierre, come on, as well as her conversation with, shall we say, a similarly closeted Hamilton Berger towards the end of the episode, it's really a deft and quick summation of the complications and obstacles of not merely just being a woman, but being a gay woman almost 90 years ago.
Yeah, the thing I like about Della's story, she sort of was the competence holding things down, both for EB and not EB.
Yeah.
Oh, is it EB?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
It was
okay.
EB.
And for Perry, she sort of was the strong hand that held things together. We see she's gone beyond that, but is still sort of, if you will, the managing partner, making sure things get done. And we learn right away that Perry has shifted towards civil practice, something he obviously isn't super fond of. And Della is the one working hard to keep the bills paid and looking at the books and the finances. And, we see that her story, she's advanced, but hit sort of, if you will, the ceiling that women face then with the restrictions on them. And, but out of the gate, I mean, just about the show in general, let me say, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about things that happen throughout the show. The thing I loved right away that brought me back to loving it in season 1 was the beautiful title sequence. And it took me back to a time of television that I think it's fitting that we're going to talk about Poker Face, that both of these shows have a look that takes me back to a different time in my life when, TV wasn't prestige and, but it was pretty damn good. And holds a fond place in my memory. So I love the way it started, and I enjoyed seeing where Della starts this season.
One last thing that just occurred to me, to if I can make one last comment about Della, because I don't think I ever said this when we discussed her in season 1, but it just it popped into my head when you mentioned EB. So it's off the cuff here. It's kind of interesting because beyond the fact that she's, the very different sort of woman that she is portrayed as in this version of Perry Mason, but I also think it's interesting to note that her in season 1, and obviously the bulk of season 1, EB was there and still alive, but to a certain extent, she almost, because if we look at all these characters as forming some sort of pseudo family, so to speak, right? She was the daughter looking after her father's interests and trying to help him and guide him, and then eventually have to bury him, with EB. With Perry, it's interesting because I think she wants it to be on more of an even keel, like a sibling kind of thing. And her frustration comes when it feels like she's now playing more of a mother, where she's the one who has to take care of things. He's being insolent and silly about things when she wants to take care of business. And I think as the series episodes will progress, and probably maybe by the very next one, once Perry's head is back in the game, I think that will probably make that relationship become more one on equal footing, like brother and sister rather than mother to son. I don't know. I'm just kind of going crazy here, but it just occurred to me when you mentioned that.
No, and I think you raise a good point. I thought one of the sort of ingenious lines that's very subtle in the first episode is when we see him riding the motorcycle, and we learn that he got that as payment from a client, and she correctly says, well, that doesn't do me any good. Like, if you accept payment from a client, of a motorcycle you ride, what good does that do the firm? It doesn't bring anything in, which means it doesn't contribute to her.
Exactly. That's an example of him doing something which was kind of like something a brash teenager would do, not not a rational, like-minded adult like she would appreciate working with at this point.
Right.
So let's then skip over to Paul Drake, who we learn has not had much in the way of paying jobs since Perry, as you mentioned, decided to pursue civil cases as opposed to criminal. Yes, there may be the odd job thrown his way, like, for example, snapping pictures inside the office of a supermarket manager, but clearly gigs are few and far between. Now, again, I love when you can do something as briefly as possible and tell us so much in some really nice and simple, succinct strokes. We get a taste of the Drake's extended family and how his marriage has really become a true partnership, and really how forward-thinking and smart his wife is, because she's the one who decides to invite Perry to the family birthday get-together, which is what leads to Strickland showing up with a job offer that, as far as, the DA Hamilton Berger is concerned, really can only be handled by someone of Drake's, well, not just his talent, but his skin color.
Yeah, and the sort of the community sense that you get that Paul Drake and his family, now have this community around them, and they're struggling, but his wife is the practical one that says you should have thought of inviting him. I shouldn't have had to be the one to do it. But that's a nice step for his wife's character, which we then see further played out, that she goes with him to the hotel to help him do part of what he does on this, let's say, curious venture, that I have questions if Hamilton Berger really is the one that wants that done. Because they're, do they really want to protect Perkins, or do they just want to find out who Perkins is meeting with to later, basically shut down all the support for him or arrest his followers, arrest him? But it's an interesting place to put Paul Drake back into the story. And I really enjoyed his arc in season 1. And I think we see other characters, as you said, other characters from last season. The corrupt cop, makes a return. We see him later with Brooks McCutcheon. Some of the players from last season are back in different new places and in interesting ways. So, I'll be interested to see what they do with Drake and see how long the story sort of this burgeoning, I don't know if this person will be portrayed as a burgeoning civil rights leader, or just, a pillar of the Black community, or what they're doing with that story. But to see Paul Drake in that and see how that may come in line with the story was a good start to put him in a new direction and doing something he's good at.
Yeah, my impression is the person that he's been tasked with keeping tabs on has his thumb in things that are both legal and illegal. So he may very well be a very outspoken person in the community, and may even have a facade, for example, of some form of a civil rights person. Although how much we would see that in the 1930s is debatable. I don't know my history very well, but so perhaps there were such. But it seems to me there's a lot more going on with him. So I do find it interesting to think that it might not necessarily be at Berger's behest, although I want to give, because I like the Strickland character so much, I kind of want to give him the benefit of the doubt that he is doing this on Berger's orders, but there still may be things going even beyond Berger, for that matter.
Right.
When you were first, outlining that and the potential of the situation, I mean, you start thinking about when we would hear things about how J. Edgar Hoover was, keeping tabs on Martin Luther King and all that sort of thing, and pretty much anyone involved in the civil rights movement. Absolutely. I just didn't, again, I might have just misunderstood or misheard. I just didn't get the sense that was what this, or maybe this character is just more openly, yeah, that's not all that I am. He's someone who wields power, even if it's in, the quote unquote minority community. but that alone, whether there's crime attached to it or not, would worry people in positions of power, especially in white America, I would say. So I am curious where it's going to go. I'm also curious that because usually, and what we saw in season 1 and what I expect to see in season 2 and whatever, usually even when you have story threads that seem unrelated, they tend to eventually intertwine and are connected to each other. So it'll be and we haven't gotten to other than what happened at the very end, we haven't seen how that murder case is going to unfold beyond the promo for the future episodes of Perry Mason. So I'm kind of curious. That's where I'm really curious where they're going to go with that story. And one last thing I'll say about Paul Drake, which I find really interesting. Perry Mason in previous incarnations, and by that I mean the original books, and then even the long-running television series. Perry Mason's the lawyer, and he would have someone do the legwork who would act as, almost like a private eye or the whatever. It was very similar to, the Nero Wolfe books where, Nero Wolfe wasn't running around town doing stuff. It was his right-hand man, Archie, who did all the legwork running around. But it was interesting when this series debuted at season 1, up until literally the last, there it is. Really the last 2 episodes, maybe. Perry was the one acting as kind of like the sort of pseudo private eye working on behalf of the law firm. And I think the transition here is, on one hand, that's what Paul Drake's kind of going to be doing. But I think my guess, just from what I feel, what we've seen already, and the way they're presenting Perry Mason, I just think it looks to me like he's going to continue to be a far more active lawyer out in the field than maybe one would be accustomed to, at least, either be real life or at least TV series wise. I mean, he's going to be a bit more than a Matlock here, so to speak.
Oh yeah. He's going to get his hands dirty. There's no doubt. And you can see, from the coming episodes montage, I mean, he's not going to be far removed from the action. But I think what that alludes to is sort of what you were talking to about Della, that this season they're all sort of moving into new positions, and that Perry's going to become sort of, the senior partner, and become EB in a sense. Della's going to hopefully try to become like the Alkalite, like Perry was in season 1. And Paul will be the third member of the team, basically the full-time investigator, maybe by the end of the season. And we'll have that core that we know of Perry Mason, that the Drake and Mason core with the added piece of Della will basically be like a fully functional,
right,
law firm, and moved into their place with their defined roles.
Yeah, and I feel also for the nature of a television series, and once you get outside of something like a Law and Order kind of procedural kind of a thing, where the roles are so clearly delineated and defined, where, so you have the first half of, I guess, the police that they won't do the quote unquote legwork, detective work, whatever, and then the second half is, okay, and now the lawyers do their thing. I wonder if, going along with what you just said, and also because they're really doing everything they can to make this different than those previous versions I mentioned of Perry Mason, it becomes a more collaborative effort on all fronts. So there may be aspects where Perry, and I think there will be. I mean, I know there will be. I'm not even going to say I think. Perry Mason is going to be an active character. He's not just going to be, doing briefs and putting pieces of paper on a wall and making connections. He's probably like every PI, he's going to get beaten up a bunch of times if he isn't beating himself up, like, having motorcycle accidents. But Paul Drake, and that's probably why you have Paul Drake working on this other case. So right. that way there's, he might be busy working on that. So then Perry has to go and do that kind of a thing is happening as well. I mean, again, I'm very excited about it, because I just think it becomes a nice kind of melding. And I'm also curious to see, and how far they can and will go, over the course of this season, and if they should even get any future seasons, and you never know. We don't know if they'll get more than another season. Who knows? But will there come a time where Della will actually be able to practice law? I'm very curious about that. I love the idea of them. I think that's where that trajectory is eventually going to be headed. I have not done my research before this podcast to know the history of women practicing law at that point in time. You might know it better than I do because of your own, you are an actual lawyer. So I don't want to make assumptions one way or the other in this. But I'm just going to go by her character on this series. That is an interesting quest for her, for both, accomplishment and acceptance. Which again is so much more than the Della Streets of the past, which is not to knock those versions, but this is 2023 now, and we're going to be making Della Street a far more active character here than she ever was before, and I'm all for it. That actress is phenomenal in that part
She's wonderful, and I will say there's two things that hearing you talk that made me reflect on, and one is, I think Perry will have to be more involved, if for no other reason that if we look at this time period, there's just places Paul Drake can't go. I mean, right. like because of the reality of the time, if a black guy showed up in a suit somewhere, people aren't going to talk, or he's not going to get in the door, quite frankly. But as far as Della, I think that at that time that there weren't strict prohibitions in some places, and that there were, trailblazing women lawyers. The problem was not so much even their ability or maybe the keeping them out, but the problem was, and it's still a problem women face, is that, a lot of people, if they're going to hire a law firm, want their lawyer to be a man. Gotcha. It's just sort of a sexist thing that I think follows into modern time. But you can imagine in the 1930s, a businessman coming in, if he can hire, a white man or a white woman, he's probably going to hire a white man. So now the great thing I think they do with her character is you do get a sense from that trial that she is pretty sharp on the law already. That maybe as far as the nuts and bolts of the law goes, she's even better than Perry. Perry's a good orator and is good on his feet and sort of, practically can do all that stuff really, really well. But as far as, knowing the law itself, the rules of evidence, things like that, they give you a hint that maybe she's really, really good at that.
Right. I would finish by saying I feel between the two, and this is probably what will eventually, it's too soon in his quote unquote career to say it, but because Perry Mason does become, whatever version you're going to do, Perry Mason's a legendary lawyer character for a reason. Right. So what we're looking at this stage is, she may be someone who already understands and knows the basics, paint by numbers kind of thing. He's already, as we see in these courtroom scenes and her reaction to him, he already goes outside the box. He's doing his own thing. He's already, it's a weird way to phrase it when we're talking about a lawyer, although we probably would have referred to Saul Goodman or Jimmy McGill this way a couple times as well. He's already being an artist,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's really good at, the thing he's really good at is digesting a bunch of stuff and putting it in a way that people don't expect or that is super compelling. And that, the scene in the courtroom where she stops him and they prepared something in a moment of hearing something or seeing something, he has really good instincts and insight is what I would say in those moments. But So maybe we should talk about him now.
Yeah, I was going to do it a few minutes ago, but then I thought of something even better. So I was like, let's stick with Paul for a little longer. Yes, of course, we do have Perry Mason himself to talk about. Now, first I'm going to dip a toe into the scene when we first see Perry Mason in this series, because it goes to something that I was already referencing earlier in the podcast, but now I'm going to use the actual phrase I've used many times on many previous podcasts. It's something I admire when I see it done well in either film or television, episode of television, and I call it the economy of storytelling. The very first scene with Perry, he's at home, and within less than a minute, we instantly know a number of things. Number one, he's obviously moved off that farm that was by the airstrip, and since we already know he's in LA, so he's clearly in some, your typical LA, luxurious, and yet because it's the 1930s, so everything looks luxurious in the 1930s, but it's an LA apartment. We see that the place is at the same time being sparse and yet unkempt. He has not bothered to unpack most of his boxes, which goes to his transitory nature. He has not been one to lay down roots. He's not one to commit to something long term. He doesn't have a sense of either belonging or permanence. That is something about his character, his personality. Think of it this way. Such as my co-host here, perhaps even, when most people choose the law profession, it's something they pursue from fairly young age, I would say, because it's something that they not just want for themselves. It becomes how they identify themselves. They refer to themselves as a lawyer. That's what they wanted to be. What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a lawyer. I don't think Perry Mason really ever said that. And at this point in time, I don't know or don't think Perry Mason actually sees himself as a lawyer. We can open this up throughout the conversation here or not, but if you watch what he does, and some of it's what we just referred to, like the very unconventional decisions that he makes, both in the courtroom and in his conversations, until we get to a moment, and I grant you it may be brief, but I'm going to say it's a key conversation to tell us all we need to know or should know about Perry Mason. I'm not talking about the conversation he has with Lupe towards the end. And by the way, I was very shocked to see Lupe even show up. Was not expecting that. I'm talking about the words he exchanges with Hamilton Berger. And, I made a joke about it in our intro, but I'm referring to the illusion of justice conversation. And I thought that was really something significant. I'm gonna put a button on that because I feel like we're gonna have a back and forth on it, because I think we can rewind and fast forward throughout the episode about Perry, about all these things. But I know that's towards the end, but I thought that was such an important and interesting conversation. It also gave us everything we need to know about Hamilton Berger, who I don't think we're going to see quite as much of throughout this season as Perry Mason, the lead character. But what I thought was fascinating is you have these two men talking about the law. And it's interesting that they both are speaking and are in places of a rather deep-rooted cynicism. But they go about it in such a very different way, and it's a different type of cynicism. Hamilton Berger's cynicism is something, it's not that he's jaded, he embraces the cynicism. He understands it. He's utilizing it. He's almost mocking it. He's mocking the idea of it because it's how he knows how he can get further in his own life and to gain greater positions of prestige and power despite the things that he has to hide about himself. Whereas Perry, that's more of a hardcore, jaded, disillusionment cynicism, because he comes from a place of righteousness. He has a more of a belief in, the righteous justice, whereas Hamilton Berger is like, well, this is what people tell themselves to make them believe. I think it's in that scene, Hamilton Berger, there's a great little bit he goes on about the courthouse. Is it the courthouse or the city hall building? Whatever. He refers to the building that was just recently built. And, and I imagine it's the building, with all the pillars and the stairs. And it's the kind of thing, it was built within just the last few years because, in LA, most of those buildings were being built around that time. It hadn't been around for, 50, 70 years before that, whatever. But it's made to look like it had been a building that had been built, hundreds of years earlier. Because much like Hollywood, LA and justice, it's all a matter of pretense. And I really loved his insight about that, and the fact that Perry gets so angry about it, which is fascinating. Here's a guy who does, as I said just moments ago, he still is not at the point where he identifies himself as a lawyer, but we do think he does want to believe in the law. From what he has done, everything from him when he fought in the war to, working with EB all that time to what he's doing now. And, I think and I guess we'll get into it as well. Obviously, what's had such a horrific impact on him is what happened after winning that case or getting that case declared a mistrial, which essentially was a win. And what happened with, oh gosh, I don't have her name in front of me. Is it Dodson? Was that the
Emily Dodson?
Emily
maybe?
Dodson. Yeah, what happens with Emily Dodson is what was, I'm going to say literally on purpose now, literally haunting him. But all that adds up to where Perry is. But like I said, we had an episode that was a robust hour in length. But I'm going to say those couple minutes outside, once you get beyond plotting and character reintroductions, I thought that was the moment that tells me so much about this character and this relationship and this show. That was, for me, I thought that was the key scene.
Yeah, that's the number one scene, because I think, speaking with a little bit of experience myself, there's nothing to make you cynical as an idealist to run into the grinding gears of the justice system, because often what's right doesn't happen, and what should happen is thwarted by the law. And I think Hamilton Berger sees the justice system in the way he describes it. And I give credit to the actor, because it was a really interesting take on how to describe how he sees his job, which basically is to give the people of bread and circus that, that they're satisfied enough to stay within the fabric of society, that you give them enough to hold society together, right? And Perry sees it as wrong to do it that way, and sees the way the law can be used, and then he himself uses the law to bludgeon someone and hurt a man, and he sees the man's wife and family and sees the real cost behind the illusion, and him smarting from that and sort of ruminating on it and getting mad. And I think probably one of the curious fallout of that is Perry storms off, and Della is able to have a perfectly, easy conversation. In many ways, she fits in with that system more than Perry, because illusion in her and Hamilton's world is important, because they also have to maintain illusions for their own protection, and they're comfortable, and they share that in common, and they share a drink and, are perfectly cordial, while Perry storms off angry. And I think at that point may have been when he headed to the farmhouse and said,
Yeah.
There's no, of all the places I least want to be, this is the one I'm, the most okay being, however he said it. But I think what we're seeing in his disillusion in that civil trial, the criminal case where you feel like you have an innocent client, win or lose, that's a just cause, taking away a man's livelihood over dollars, and a delicious, heel turn by Sean Astin here as, the greedy shopkeeper, and sort of showing, if you have a client who wants to do something and can use the law against someone, and you're willing to facilitate that, you can. And I think that really left a bad taste in his mouth.
Right. It's interesting because I think Perry would have, especially when he switched from criminal to civil, but he still felt, I'm going to do what I can to fight for the little guy. And here he's steamrolling over the little guy on behalf of this guy who, have we cursed yet on this podcast? Because there's no way I gotta throw a curse in here right now. Sean Astin's character, Sonny Grease, I think his name is, which is great. Great name, by the way. He's a piece of shit. And I love that they did that. And I'm fascinated because I took a look on back on the old IMDb there. He's in the entire season. So I'm kind of curious, wait, this is going to be a running thing with this character? I'm just curious. I mean, again, my feeling is all threads eventually intertwine, intertangle, however you want to say it. How does that get... Because at this point, why would we still be involved with that case anymore? I don't think we would be. But I looked him up. He's listed 8 episodes, all 8 episodes. So I'm like, okay, I'm fascinated. And again, it seems like most of the time when we see Sean Astin, I mean, I can think of a few playing a bad guy once or twice. I think wasn't he a bad guy briefly on 24 million years ago, I think. But generally speaking, we don't think of him that way. We think we think of Lord of the Rings. We think of, well, he was so nice in that season of, was it Stranger Things? And it's like, oh, and he got killed. Oh, spoiler. Anyway.
It's a good casting choice, really, because they also flip the expectation. You start the case with sympathy towards him, and they start to prove maybe this guy stole his ideas. But then by the end of that scene, you're like, Perry's probably going to win, and he probably shouldn't. This guy's this guy's kind of a jerk, and that guy has a family, and he's going to lose everything. And it was a great scene in that it twisted at the end in a really good way to subvert your expectation, and having Sean Astin be Perry's client helped that, I think.
Right. And what was also to go along with that was an interesting choice, where they could have went in a direction which I think might have actually been a little bit cliched, and maybe something that might have been done, on a series decades earlier. I'm not saying Perry Mason, but whatever. But that's not. But the writing of things like this is so much better now, or so much more multi-layered now, I should say. So if this had been done, whatever, 30, 40, 50, whatever years ago, Perry Mason tanks the case.
Yeah, absolutely.
On purpose.
Yeah.
Clearly, he does not do this here. At least unless something changes, but it looks like that is not what's going to happen. It looks like, this guy, he's still going, he has to move forward with nailing this guy to the wall and basically rooting him for the rest of his life, et cetera, whatever. And I just think, I love that decision, because it really speaks more to why he's so, because even though he tried to switch to civil from criminal, because he thought that would almost be like a safer way to go. And yet you can still be disillusioned. I keep using that word tonight. I'm sorry. Or just, because now it's not just about the law. It's just about people, about society, and this isn't even a matter of, it's not about gender or race or any of those sort of things. You can say maybe to a certain extent it's about class, but that's, whatever. It's just how, one man, it's a man's inhumanity to another man, to another person. And he has to, the fact that he has to still be a tool for that, and he has to go along with it. It's little wonder that he's in a much worse state of mind when we get towards the end of this episode.
Right. And they even drive that home, because when he takes the settlement offer to him at the store, and they have that, like basically it looks like he's having Sonny's radio hour or whatever in the store. And he talks to him and says, here's the offer. You'll get this. He'll do that. And, Sonny basically says, no, I want to crush him. I want this to through. Are you a fighter? Do you want to, kill or not kill? And Perry doesn't walk away then. Like, he goes back to court, gets the verdict, and the verdict is what he thought. And he predicted when they walked out, he probably just won the case. But because, part of if your livelihood is doing that, you can't lose, because you've got to have the money. And, he's tied to that system that he has to make money for the firm, for his own livelihood. And he probably just feels really dirty about it, really scummy.
And they make a point of making it clear that it's not like the firm is doing extremely well.
Right.
So you can't just do that, because they're barely able to pay for the roof over their head, and also to afford the secretary that Della hired, even though she figured we can just afford that, but nothing more. Now, the one let's just get to the one other, something you also had brought up before, but go a little bit more into the other major aspect of this episode, which is introducing a new set of characters, which is going to be part of what's going to be the case. Moving from like the next episode on, and that's the McCutcheons. Mainly we meet the son. What was his first name again? It's slipping my mind for a second.
Brooks.
There it is.
Classic baseball name, Brooks.
Classic uppity rich guy name.
Also that, but let me say before we get too deep into this, there it is. Let me say, and disillusioned, and then we have keywords. So you can play a drinking game.
There you go.
I was tickled when I watched this episode, and I thought, you know what? We loved Perry Mason season 1. How do we make Perry Mason season 2 a little more? What ingredient can we add to make this stew a little better?
I know.
And I thought for you and me, it's like, oh my God, there's a whole baseball plot here.
I knew that's what you were going to say.
We're going to talk about baseball, and as much as as much as most of America has not stuck with baseball, you and I have. And I did sort of a deep dive on baseball. I was like, is Bake Matthews a real pitcher? And turns out he's not. But I found like a St. Louis Cardinal person that may approximate Bake Matthews. But I thought it was very. I thought that was kind of a cool detail that there was a baseball subplot.
Oh yeah, I plan to mention it. So we're meeting the McCutcheons and that Brooks. He's apparently the person who ordered the arson that we see take place in the very opening scene of the episode. It's like an arson on a barge where a party was taking place, a barge called the Lux. And that's where, that's where we got that lovely opening title credit that we loved last scene, where they have to, and the silhouette of who we later learn is actually Detective Holcomb, standing in front of the A in Perry Mason, I think, I was like, there are some shows that get kind of funky, funny with credits on the screen or words, whatever. Sometimes they overdo it, something, whatever. Then going this classic, and it's I don't even attribute it more to the TV series and more as just movies of that era. I just love that, and then making it, modernizing it by having people like or objects be in front of the letters. I just adore that. But I'm the kid who was like, when I was 8 years old and I had bought a comic book and Batman's head was blotting out part of his own logo. I remember going, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Because I'm ridiculous. So anyway, Brooks, McCutcheon. We know pretty quickly, again, painting pictures really fast, he's perhaps a slightly deviant, faux family man, although he does seem to really care about his kids, but he also has daddy issues of his own. And the man is 20 plus years ahead of time with his baseball dreams. That's really kind of remarkable. There's a lot of good reasons why there's no way you could have West Coast baseball at that point in time. It's the length of the trips, because it would only, at that point in time, because it's still the early 30s, it would have to be by train. That's not happening. It just for practical reasons. That's why I think they even reference it in the episode. But also, I'm a bit of a baseball historian myself. That's why you don't really have baseball west of the Mississippi. It's because because all you had was train travel. We hadn't gotten to aerial planes that could put teams of people on them. But I love that whole thing. But then we meet his dad. We get the sense of the father-son relationship. It's kind of what we thought it was going to be before he even sits down to talk to his father. Maybe his father isn't quite as mean as I was expecting him to be, but he's still very, what's the word I'm looking for? He still diminishes his son. He's kind of like dismissive. He's dismissive of his dreams.
I would say distant. There's a distance.
There's a distance there. He's like, and he basically don't stick to the charity work, to soup kitchens that we later see as something that they're known for doing, whatever. And so that's kind of this. We see these little pieces of these characters, and like I said, and the funny thing is, because it's the early 30s, we already know that this dream of his can't happen anyway. This isn't Tarantino saying, "Hey, you know what? Maybe we kill Hitler in a movie theater." No, we can't. We're not changing the course of time here, and going. No, what if there was baseball in L.A. 20 years earlier with a major league team? No, we're not going to do that. But what we do see is that by the end of the episode, he's mysteriously murdered. And we don't know by who. We don't see who's holding that gun. But we do see from the promos for the future episodes that it looks like 2 young Mexican fellows are arrested and charged. And that's going to be the case that's going to bring Perry back to the practice of criminal law. If there's more you want to say about the McCutcheons, certainly feel free. I don't really know if there is. I was like, I think I recognize one of the kids, one of his sons, but I was like, who cares? It was interesting because I think the only reason you introduced Brooks McCutcheon as someone who just basically had, some sex with someone other than his wife, and there was obviously some autoerotic asphyxiation involved there. When she was like, grabbing on her throat, you're really, okay, was he just choking her? And then we see the belt, like, oh, this was, it wasn't just, choke me while you do this. It was, there's some hardcore, might have been some Michael Hutchins stuff going on here, but yet she was the one who apparently was being choked. But other than there being maybe a hint of that during the conversation between him and his father about where he was, everything else we see about him seems above board, and he seems like an actual reasonably decent person with actual creditable and reasonable aspirations of what he wants to do. Being baseball fans, it probably helps us as well, whatever. The only reason you show that is, okay, that's going to be something when we go further through this season, we're going to be prying apart this guy. And we're going to be learning all these other bad or seedy things about him because that's just the nature of these things. And that was just a hint to us, like, yeah, he's not, there's a facade at work here, and we're just informed right off the bat. It just happens to be about, I'm not clear if that was just any woman or if she was a paid sex worker or what that part. If there was a reference to that, I might have missed it. I made a point of really not trying to take too many notes while I was watching it. But either way, that's the only reason you do that. Cause maybe that'll go to, we'll learn more about his marriage. Maybe we'll learn more about other things or maybe, or things that people might have had on him by showing us that little moment, it's kind of like dropping a little clue here of something we're probably going to hear a lot more about throughout the rest of the season. At least that's the way I interpreted it.
Yeah, it's that, or the other side of it is the guy had some kinks that at that time probably would have been super embarrassing if anyone knew about. And for that reason, his dad wanted him out of the public spotlight because he could embarrass the family. Or he could be subject to blackmail or somebody, getting the goods on him or whatever. But as you said earlier in the podcast, within one episode, you get a sense that the thing I liked about his arc was you got a sense this guy was a big dreamer, willing to take a big swing. And even when people were telling him no, he was trying to push for something that actually his arguments are right. He just was a man ahead of his time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and like I was saying, I think there are some practical reasons why it wouldn't have worked in the 1930s, but I give the man credit for still trying to pursue that. Maybe he was coming up with some ideas how it could work, but I think that would involve having teams, in place in between West, from
right.
that area all the way through LA. So you would have shorter train trips from one to the other, but eventually at a certain point, you're going to have to be cross country because the majority of baseball teams were all situated, on the East Coast. St. Louis was pretty much as far west as you got. By the way, I'm just wondering, was the pitcher you're referring to? I'm just going to go out on a limb. Was it Dizzy Dean? Is that who you were thinking of?
No, I forget the name, but there was a St. Louis Cardinals pitcher a little bit later in time than that Bake Matthews, but had a nickname. But I love the idea of bringing somebody everybody knew out. I thought, and I guess sort of to wrap up my thoughts about the episode, Um, the thing I really, really enjoyed about watching this show, and I think it was the same last time we watched it, the first season, they have a whole lot of stuff going on. This is not like an A story and a B story. This is like an A, B, C, and D story going and filling an hour with that. And yet none of those stories felt like they got short shrift, or you didn't see movement or figure out where the characters were. And even Bake Matthews has brought in 2 scenes. So, this pro person is really working with Brooks McCutcheon, and Brooks McCutcheon gets an arc. It really was, I thought, top level writing and execution to put that many pieces in play and tell that story in the time they did. So it makes me really look forward to this season. And I'll just say I haven't read in depth any of the reviews that have come out about the season. I've just read the headlines of those reviews because I didn't want to read to color my own opinion or view it with any thoughts. But I'm really encouraged because some critics I really like have really praised season 2 from what they've seen on their advanced copies. So I'm really looking forward to this season.
Yeah, same thing. Fortunately, I was trying to read it through Facebook or something, and Firewall blocked me from reading past the first few sentences, and then I realized maybe that's a good thing, because I don't, like you said, I don't want my view to be overly colored by reading. I just want to get the general sense. That's all. And when, much like yourself, if I see certain, there's only a handful of, especially TV critics, I even give to, what they have to say. And I see them being positive and in fact saying they like it better than the first season, I'm like, ooh, that's kind of cool. And also to wrap up and going along with what you said, what I really loved is basically, I feel that there are several seeds of interest that have been planted in this episode. So I'm looking forward to seeing how they are sown and how they grow over the next several weeks. I wish the show was about a botanist, because then that would have made some sense for me to use that analogy. But, and there was so much going on in this episode. There were things we really didn't even touch on in this conversation, but I have made a decision, which I wish I had done back in the day. You don't need to talk about every single last detail of an episode. like so we didn't really touch on the dream thing with Emily Dodson or certain other little aspects, but that's okay. We don't have to talk about everything. But I'm very encouraged by what we saw. I have said a billion times before, and I'll say it again, I love movies and television series that take place in this period of time. Ooh, the early 30s. Everybody looks great. I love the performers on the show. I'm looking forward to we're going to move forward. I'm wondering how much Hamilton Burger we are going to get. Justin Kirk, it's my favorite thing he's done, because he was one of the only things I liked about Weeds for a while there, and then I even got tired of him on that as well. But I love. We just get little tastes of him here, and he's just a lot of fun. And very happy. In fact, if I had any criticism of the episode or the series at all, and I bet if we had time to waste, I would give you, I would have a ticking clock for you, Brian. And my only hint would be, it's incredibly stupid. You'd probably get it, just like that. My only critique of the series, but I don't want there to be dead air on the podcast. So unless you're going to blurt something out, I'll say what it is.
Say it.
I know they finally touched on it to a certain extent in the very last episode of season 1. Not good enough. And I know someone out there is going to say, well, if you listen, there are certain slight melodic strains here and there. Nah. I don't mind if you do some sort of updated version, or if you mess around with it a bit here or there. But if you're going to do a Perry Mason series, I want the Perry Mason theme. It needs to be used to some extent. Play with it, change it, jazz it up, whatever. But it's still, and I know people are going to like, but no, then it's not clear enough. And I can point to other series that you and I believe both watch that are being done right now, and they can do their own thing if they want as well. But they both know, hey, you know what? We at least have to have a nod to the original music from the original series that spawned this, 50, 60, whatever years ago. So if I'm watching, by the way, it's not going to be the first time I bring one of these shows up in this podcast. Wait for it. So if I'm watching Picard or Strange New Worlds, do they find some way to still work in a little bit of the theme or a major part of the theme from the original Star Trek series? Yes, they do. So that's the only, again, I don't care, but when the credits were rolling, I was listening to the music and they were like, it was really just, very jazz, whatever. I was like, okay, I'm listening. I'm like, wait a minute. Why wouldn't they have, come on, people? I was playing it back like, oh, is that supposed to be it right there? Nah, it's not good enough.
Maybe it's going to be a device that they'll play when he gets his mojo back.
No, they're going to do it at the last episode every season. So
every season.
And just be like, here you go, Scott. We made, it's bad enough the world made you wait like 6 years for golden boots on another TV show. Now we're making you wait for this. All right. Enough of that. So we can we can close the book on Perry Mason for this week because now it's time to buckle up. Now, there may be a few out there who like to mock me and my monologues. So Brian, you can, I know unlike myself, you're not having alcohol this evening. So you can sip your non-alcoholic beverage for a moment or two. Because I am finally going to get to talk about that show I've been wanting to talk about for the last several weeks. And that show would be Poker Face. Even though there's part of me that really wants to talk about how bad an app or a streaming service Peacock is, but I don't want to spend that much time on it. Except, by the way, if you start watching Peacock or anything else on that show, better just watch it straight through. Don't pause it for a while. If you have to go to the bathroom, because you're screwed. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. But instead, I'm going to annoy most listeners by saying I'm going to talk about Poker Face, and now I'm going to do that by talking about another series, which is literally one of my all-time favorite television productions. And, look, if I was composing a list that wasn't confined to the last 25 years, but just the history of television, this is a series that would be landing in my top 10. And there's a reason why I want to talk about it. And it's not just because I'm participating in some bracket challenge on Twitter, for all the guest villains. It's because there is a direct and a massive tie-in to Poker Face. So just take the train ride with me. We'll get to the station eventually, It may be a local. We may be passing by stops that you had no interest in seeing. But look out the window. The view is lovely. We're going to get there. I want to talk a little bit about Columbo first. Columbo. Yeah, all the 20-somethings that listen to our podcast, there's like probably two people. They're like, who? What? The yogurt? No. I'm talking about perhaps the most iconic TV detective of all time, which featured perhaps the best performance by any actor as a detective on television of all time, blowing past any cops from The Wire or The Shield or NYPD Blue or Homicide or whatever else you got. Honestly, the closest you get to Peter Falk's Columbo would probably be James Garner's Jim Rockford as far as iconic performance and detectives in the medium of television. They are both on that genre's Mount Rushmore. But that series, which was really a handful of mystery movies that were released every year from 1971 to 1978, and they did come back and started to do them again in the late 80s and 90s, although those were never as good. They were fun, but never as enjoyable, never as good. But getting back to the point, Columbo was designed not so much as a police procedural, even though you can say it was. It's the most famous example of a series in the how catch 'em genre. That's one word pushed together. It's not how catch them, it's how catch 'em genre. It's an inversion of the classic whodunit murder mystery. Whereas instead, with a whodunit, we know full well who did it. The fun is watching how the detective pursues the killer as well as how the killer attempts to avoid detection. It's something that we've been seeing and we saw in films like Dial M for Murder or famous Dorothy mystery novels like those that were written by Dorothy L. Sayers, the Lord Peter Wimsey books, whatever. You can say they did that in older series back in the 60s, like your Dragnets and whatever else. But it's Columbo that was the gold standard, and it's easily the most famous series to ever use that method of storytelling. Also with Columbo, there had never been another series to attract actors and stars to appear as either a victim or murderer, especially murderer, on Columbo, since the only exception might be the 1960s Batman series, maybe. With Columbo, every episode, you would spend the first 15 to 20 minutes with the killer. You would typically see the motivation for the crime, the planning, the execution, the covering up. In most cases, there actually are a couple exceptions, but everything happens before Lieutenant Columbo is actually on the scene. And then as you watch, you have to decide at what point do we think he's actually suspicious of the killer? How many times will he have his just one more thing to ask? And how will he trip up that murderer? And the villains themselves, sometimes they're detestable, and sometimes they're not just understandable, they're downright likable. I mean, you could have Leonard Nimoy being the worst person imaginable in one episode. Then the next episode, it's Johnny Cash, and you kind of want him to get away with it. And it's that series, and here we go, here the train's pulling in now. It's that series and those conceits that was the initial and honestly the primary, although there are other things which I'll mention shortly, primary inspiration for Rian Johnson to create Poker Face. Now, anyone who's listened to this podcast over the years knows how much we hold Rian Johnson. Am I pronouncing his first name correctly? Is it Rian? I feel like I might be screwing it.
I say Ryan, but I don't know for sure. I've never looked it up.
I didn't think of it until just now, and I can't remember how I pronounced it when we've talked about Ozymandias and other things, because as I was just about to say, although his work in films, I think for the most part has been superlative, Looper, Knives Out, even his polarizing Star Wars film, it's Ozymandias. It's The Fly. It's Breaking Bad. No worries. You don't got to say anything else. You stop right there. But the thing with Poker Face, it's not that it's simply an updated version of Columbo, even if it's a loving homage from the title fonts that are used to open every episode. Oh, I love the copyright date. By the way, I watched an episode of Columbo this week, and when I saw the copyright date under the title, see, I knew they took that from that. Or the fact that our somewhat intrusive main character is also a smoker. Though I hear Miss Leone, the poster girl for smoking, if there ever was one for the last 20 years, has actually been trying to quit. But there's also a slight serialized nature to her character's journey, never more so than when we get to the finale, as she spends the series on the run from an infamous casino owner gangster type from the very end of the first episode on. So every episode, she's in a new town, location, different jobs, trying to stay off the grid, not to be tracked down, trying to avoid the law at all costs, which is actually a nice subversion of the Columbo concept. She's not working on behalf of the law. She's trying to avoid the law. It's more like The Fugitive or even The Incredible Hulk. You could even throw in something like Quantum Leap if you really want to stretch it to that extent. I mean, and I know, Brian, you can certainly toss other shows and even movies, the series makes nods to from episode to episode, from Magnum to Murder, She Wrote. But what's truly wonderful about the series that we will both, I see you chomping, that we will both be talking about in a second. So pardon my extended monologue here. Oh, podcast critics out there. What I love is that it embraces a form of TV storytelling that many had either ran away from or had consigned to the sort of mundane fare one can find on any random broadcast TV network. Looking especially at you, CBS. And I didn't forget about you either, NBC and your 1001 Dick Wolf shows. But what Poker Face does is that it picks up the gauntlet of those NBC mystery movies I mentioned earlier, and the Columbo episode specifically, and it creates a perfect little concoction with every episode. Even though there is that serialized nature that threads its way through episode to episode, regardless of that, each one becomes a lovely little standalone movie that may or may not have thin threads of our own character, Charlie Cale, trying to avoid the pursuit of Benjamin Bratt's Cliff. That's the security dude working for the casino owner. I just love that it embraces the one and done kind of storytelling. And that's where it kind of eerily reminds me of a show I mentioned a little while ago, the new Star Trek series, Strange New Worlds, which is an ongoing series, which is also both functions as an homage and embracing an old series from decades ago, but even though it's got some serialized tweaks to it that heighten the suspense from week to week, it also functions as one standalone episode after another. So many have run away from it. I love that we have two really great series, totally, again, embracing that. I did leave out one of the central and fun conceits of the series, which I'm going to say is probably less a nod to the shows. I'll say shows. Lists kill me all the time. The shows in the 1970s, and maybe perhaps more of a wink at the almost impossibly prescient and perceptive to the point of being superpower characters of, the last 20 odd years. I'm talking about shows like Monk and House and so many others. Is that in this series, Charlie, or Charlie Cale, is a human lie detector, or she would undoubtedly put it, a bullshit detector. All right. I said that, Brian. Guess what? I'm going to tag you in now. I gave my preface, my preamble, the overview. My spiel is over. We got 10 episodes we can delve into. I'm not saying we're going to talk about all 10. That would be crazy. But, the finale aired tonight. I believe we're going to need to talk about that one. But I'm going to leave it to you to open this up. Go. I'm getting out of the cab. You can take over the train now. You can go wherever you want to go. You can go to the West Coast and bring over a baseball team if you want.
Well, I'm going to hop in my sweet ass ride and drive across America for about a year, dodging mob bosses. I will say I love my preamble will start by saying this. This show has rules that I enjoy. That it sets that Charlie can tell what the truth is. So we know that. So we play along with her and we watch what people say and consider what we know from the beginning that Charlie doesn't know that she's going to learn, and how language is used. Like, some people aren't discovered till later in the episode because the right question isn't asked or they don't say the right thing. And we're waiting to figure out how language is going to be used. So there's really creative use of language in the writing in this show to frame the questions and investigation to where she figures it out. And it's different in every episode. We know that, and let me back up and just say this. The one thing I've heard that annoys the shit out of me is when people say, well, everywhere she goes, somebody dies. That's not realistic. You're watching a show where she's a human lie detector and can always tell when people lies. Okay. If that's the conceit and you're okay with that, but you can't buy that she's someplace where people die. Like, if you can't suspend your disbelief beyond that, go watch Dick Wolf shows. Okay. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, the conceit of the show is outlandish and incredibly enjoyable. So I just want to put that out there. So if that's a criticism you have, don't watch a show about a person's a human lie detector. But the rules as they apply to this show and the way they apply them is very creative. There's the idea that no matter what trouble she gets into, she can't call the police. No matter what trouble she gets into, she can't let her name get out there. So we established this sort of rules of the road for her trip that are very compelling to us as we watch. The next thing I'd like to say, and you and I talked about this, after about the second episode, you figured out the structure of the show. And from then on, when you watch the prologue, the murder, you try to figure out where's Charlie going to be in that, where was she when this was happening? And you try to guess where it's at, which makes for a fun game. Because then when we go back and see the different viewpoint replay of the episode, it's like, oh, she's this. And I think, I enjoyed greatly when she was the merch girl for the band. That was an interesting place, and probably my favorite thing. And I have to think that Natasha Lyonne was probably thrilled that she got to be and do a lot of work with Nick Nolte in the Orpheus episode. That she starts delivering human hair. She has all these weird jobs, and he offers her a job, and she sees this former, guy down on his luck. And he's almost like the Perry Mason character that is so despondent and cynical that he just brutally tells the truth. And she like becomes enamored of him, that he's completely unadorned of any affectation whatsoever, and goes to work for him. So there's that. Then there's the idea that in some episodes, the killers don't get caught on screen because that can't happen. They're busted by podcast hosts. They're busted by, a recording that's made and sent out to an audience. So it's not a traditional show in that we get to see the bad guys let off in cuffs, or we get to see them dead always, but we know they got their comeuppance. I love the use of music in this show. And I have to say, not since maybe dueling banjos has there been more use of a banjo and that little melodic theme that plays. It's so catchy.
It's the Here's Charlie Now theme.
Yes, and it's so melodic, and it's like a really, really unique choice for that to be played on a banjo. I love that. There's great music throughout. The guest stars are amazing. And if I have to single out, I think the two things I would talk about in particular, I really enjoyed the rock and roll, the metal one. Was it R.I.P. to Metal or
Rest in Metal?
Rest in Metal. I really enjoyed that one because in that episode where it took her, she traveled with the victim. And we got to see a side of the victim, the sort of dumbass drummer who shows up and acts like a fool. We get to see a side of him through her eyes, traveling as the merch girl. And I like that episode, and I like the humor in it. The guitar player is selling his shit on eBay, and they keep saying, "Don't sell stuff on eBay," and the dumbass sells stuff on eBay. And I really liked Escape from Shit Mountain, which just is an all-time name for an episode, but a great episode. And the show even gets meta about itself in that episode, because she's the victim. And when the girl pulls up in her car, she says, "Are you me?" And it flips that she's the one that has been victimized. We don't realize that initially. And because the show's always set it up a different way, when that happened and it comes back from the first break and you see it's her, you think the girl's riding with her is the one that's going to get hit. And it's not, it's Charlie.
Right.
And we see that journey. And I can't say enough. I don't know if there's been a show, probably, Scott, since the heyday of the 70s that's been able to get so many stars. And I would say Rian Johnson probably has to do with that. But you can just talk about the stars in these shows. And, you had Nick Nolte, Cherry Jones, and Luis Guzman in the Orpheus episode. You had Joseph Gordon-Levitt in Shit Mountain. I mean, just a murderer's row of, we had Adrian Brody, we had, pun intended, Adrian Brody, Ron Perlman, Benjamin Bratt signed on to basically do the whole season. And even, I'll save talking about the finale. I think we can put that at the end. But questions that maybe you had, like, how long is this happening? Like, where all has she gone? The show masterfully tied that all together. And I think you hit the nail on the head that this is a love letter to 70s TV, but it's not derivative of 70s TV. It takes the form and takes what that is, and, if you will, advances it in a really creative way. But I love the way it looks. Some of the places she's at, the way people dress is timeless. It's not rooted in the past and it's not rooted, in the most modern fashion today. There are places she's at that it could be the 70s. There's places she's at it could be the 80s. There's places she's at it could be today. If I think back I like the race car driver one because I like the flip in that we watch the initial thing and we find out later it's his daughter. That was a good flip. And the guy who you feel sorry for, they flip that on you because he removed the seatbelt. So there's so many nice twists and turns. And when I reflect on you talking about, Columbo, I think you and I talked about this the other day, and I've noticed it since we talked about it. I caught the last 2 or 3 episodes in the last couple of days. She even sort of does the walk away and walk back move. Like the only thing missing occasionally is maybe her waving the cigarette a little more every time, but she does at some point. But it's just, I think this show gives me something to look at that I'm interested about. I get to play a little game watching it. Like how's she going to figure it out? Where was she at the beginning? What are the lies going to be? And that makes for really interesting viewing.
Right. And one of the things you touched on, and I'll expound on a little bit more, and how it further differentiates itself from something like Columbo, for example. And I'm saying this as, hardcore Columbo fan, but why I like this series so much is while it's clearly nods and homage and whatever else that show, they also make very conscious decisions to, yes, we can do that, but we're also going to flip it on you. We're going to, I don't want to keep using phrases like subvert. It's not exactly the same thing, but I like the idea of flipping things on you. Either, where's like, say the race car driver episode that you mentioned where, and that was, the future of the sport, the 7th episode. And the entire thing we're watching through the opening, and the expectation is the person that she will be at some point pursuing till the end of this is over is going to be the Tim Blake Nelson character. And then they switch it on. It's like, yeah, he was up to something nefarious. And then he actually confesses because of what happened to his daughter. And it's the person that she had been siding along with and had actually grown even attracted to and had a connection with. That's the person who's actually going to be the quote unquote villain of the piece. And that's and that's also an example of something you mentioned where by the end of it, no, he isn't being arrested and being led away to the police or anything, but it's almost like she just drops the thought in his head and he's left in this, and it's a lovely, callback to something that's talked about earlier in the episode. It's almost like having the shakes before whatever. And you see that all of a sudden he has it and you realize that dream you had, what you were never going to fulfill it.
Yeah. And it's called losing your flow.
Right. And we can almost be okay with that being the resolution because not everything needs to be tied up as neatly as we'd expect it to because she's not a cop. She's not a detective. And also at the very least, at least the person who almost died didn't die. And they are, from what we understand by the end of the episode, they are recovering. So at least there is that. It would maybe be more troubling if the person had died and the person, to one extent or another, quote unquote, got away with it. But they do things like that throughout the what do you call it? The Escape from Shit Mountain one is an amazing, the meta aspect of it, where she's the actual victim throughout it. And there's so many really interesting twists and turns that episode takes, and they're playing with a couple of different kind of I wouldn't say they're genres so much as storytelling devices all within one episode. And I love how the creation throughout that episode, we're working out how they do that. We work everything from, okay, we're dealing with a character who ostensibly we know is going to be the villain. At least we assume he's going to be the villain because, that race car driver told us never assume. But we also know he's got, the ankle thing going on there. It's that he's confined, to house arrest or something. And how do we get around that? And we know that's kind of like a form of a ticking bomb in the episode on top of everything else. And then we have what takes place over the course of time at the motel, where it's almost like you're confining space. You're trapped here. There's a snowstorm outside. I love it's all these familiar little ideas all come to roost all in one episode. And then they do something bizarre like, wait a minute, where did they bury someone? Under a tree? Is that where the hobbits live?
Right.
But I just loved it. And he's like, and we're going to keep using the same hole to keep burying people.
The spot, man. We got to have to go to the spot.
If it works, it works. But I noticed, and I have a special adoration for every single episode of the season. And of course, I could cite ones that were earlier on. And I kind of you almost want to take away the two bookends, because I think they're separate from everything else. Because the first episode, everything's unfolding and explaining the entire premise of the series and what the ongoing plot's going to be. Even though it does still have that format to it of the opening 15 minutes, then we bounce back and we meet Charlie, and that's how. And when we first see that, we're like, oh, that's weird. Well, that's different than Columbo or whatever. And then by the time we get to the next, I'm like, oh, that's how they're going to do this. Yeah. Okay, that's the format for this. Let's enjoy that. But where I'm going with this is, even though there's no episode I don't like, I love them all for different reasons. But I also noticed that as we get to the later stage, the second half of the season, because they did split it up when they rolled these things out for us, I noticed that the episodes, actually, for me at least, I hate to say that they got better from episode to episode, but I think they just became almost more inventive. I think they played with the format just a little bit more each time. So they took more chances with each episode, like the one that you mentioned with Nick Nolte. And I think that's the one that, if I'm not mistaken, let me look. Yes, Orpheus Syndrome, Natasha Lyonne herself directed that one, and she even co-wrote that episode. There's something really, I hate to use the word like artsy, because that sounds a little, bourgeois, whatever, but there's something kind of nice 70s trippy about it. Especially, not just the fact that we're dealing with, almost long forgotten form of the special effects medium that we don't really see as much nowadays with stop motion and things like that. It seems to be few and far between in the era of CGI and whatever. But when you watch like the final scene of that episode, that looks like something that could have been on a 1970 episode of Night Gallery, quite frankly, right, or something like that.
Right. Or even like in that episode, I mean, I think, there's sort of a nod to the Tom Savinis of the world, the special effects makers that sort of fall out of favor. And the play between, there's even sort of a commentary in that about the danger of digitization. That but for the real film, you could just erase what happened on something digitized, but he spliced out the real film to save it. And I think an ingenious nod. I mean, lights and magic, like LAM, like it's not that different than industrial light magic.
Oh, no,
it's. But that's what's beautiful. That's what's beautiful about it. And I have to say, a couple of things along the way that stood out. I think you're right about the second half, that they sort of swung bigger, but they were able to do that because the first half was successful. And so I think, like an episode, The Stall, the barbecue episode, that was a really good episode that I loved in particular, because you had the ridiculous conceit of the racist dog who, would only stop barking if you played like, conservative talk radio. But you see her effect on people, that sort of her relationship with, the pit guy, and them watching movies and stuff, that he decides like he doesn't want to do barbecue anymore. Like it sort of fleshed out a little bit of her character, that in a lot of people's lives, she makes a difference, that she is a good person and she's on the run. And I love that they still, even when they do a heavy episode, there's like running gags and silly things like, Mortimer Bernstein taking her wallet, that they care. And my favorite line, Mortimer Bernstein, you son of a bitch. It just, there's just the ultimate blend of comedy, drama, mystery, suspense, intrigue. It's just really a great concoction of all these things that I think they sort of build the set in the first half of the season and play with it in the second half.
Well, the way if I was to do a speed rundown of how I feel and how they create this arc throughout the entire season, and again, the first episode is the setup of Charlie Cale herself.
Yes.
So yes, we have the murder and everything else that happens with Adrian, but it's the setup of who she is, and it's the why now, and what we're going to see for the next several episodes. So that's what episode 1 is. Episode 2 is the episode where, okay, now we're going to establish what it is we're going to be doing on this series. That she's going to be going to different locations, and she's going to, again, as some people had issues with, but those of us who understand the medium of television, we embrace, because that's the fun of it. You're missing the fun of it if you're going to be questioning why there's a murder every week. Then guess what? Good thing you didn't live in the 80s, because you would have Murder, She Wrote would have blown your mind. But the purpose, anyway, I want to stay on a roll here. The purpose of that second episode is, this is the kind of thing she's gonna do. And look, here's a little detective story. Here's a little mystery thing. And look how we're gonna trick you occasionally. We're not gonna realize, oh, that woman, she's actually the truck driver in that truck. And this is how these little things are gonna come together. But how are we gonna, but we have to remind you, she has to be on the run. She's gotta worry. There's a time issue here. So the second episode establishes, this is what we're gonna be doing. And this is, and here's what the stakes are. Oh, if she, because she's trying to stay off the grid, but things go wrong. Third episode is the one you mentioned, the stall episode. I don't think, again, I like all episodes. I'm probably not as partial to that episode as you are. So I don't really have as much to say about it other than like, hey, racist dog. But, we both have a lot of affection for the fourth episode, Rest in Metal. You nailed it perfectly. And I think that is the major function of that episode. It's not just, we're going to play with your expectations or your perception, as far as a killer is concerned. This is where it's about the victim. And the victim that we just thought was a total, Spinal Tap referencing, not reference himself, he hasn't referenced Spinal Tap, doofus. And we realize, there was a lot more to him. And now the fact that his death, it feels far more tragic and heartfelt than it did just 15 minutes earlier. We go to the next episode, and there's where they pick up where the reminder for old fogies like me, you guys are like Columbo, because, the one thing we haven't really had, because, I can't really make a case for the metal band. You can, but I wouldn't, because I think they showed Chloe Sevigny characters can be kind of, see you next Tuesday from time to time throughout that episode. But Time of the Monkey, the one with Judith Light and Essapathia Merkelson, until we find the real details about what they did back in their radical youth, we love them. And when we hear, and we find out that the guy if it wasn't for him, she would have been in prison for those years and lost the function of her whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's like, we understand. He should have died. Yeah, she was right to kill them. And then she also has and I think, if I'm not mistaken, unless I'm forgetting something, I think that's the first one where Charlie actually has physical altercations with the people that she's about to reveal as the killers, whatever. So and that was the final episode of the first half that we saw, and I said, okay, they established what this character is, what she's doing, and here's the different types of quote unquote villains, whatever. You've done the establishing. We're going to take a breather now. Let's see where you go with the second half. Second half, we've talked about this. Exit stage death. The way they tricked us. I love them finally, because the idea with your Columbos and shows of that nature, we know everything. This one, we didn't. They tricked us, and we love the fact that they did that. And and characters that we might have thought we liked were like, oh no, they're pretty horrible. Oh, they're really hard. You know, those two that we liked in the other episode. Oh, we hate them now. We hate these two now. Love that, and I love the fact that, like, okay, guess what? We can play with your expectations in a totally new way. There are things that you're gonna think were one thing, not something else. So guess what? And then they take that to a further extreme with Future the Sport that we just talked about, the race car driver, and then the Orpheus syndrome, which is just, you know what I loved about that episode that we didn't mention? You mentioned, obviously we were talking about how great Nick Nolte was in it, and really what makes that episode so memorable is the relationship between Charlie and Nick Nolte. But it's also the lovely idea that we always have the goofy concept of her being a human lie detector.
Mm-hmm.
I love the idea that, because every time someone does something, she kind of winces, like it physically hurts her, like it really is some sort of weird superpower. and
she develops a twitch.
She has a twitch, and the fact that she gravitates to the Nick Nolte character so much because she never has to twitch around them, because as you said yourself, he's nothing but honest in everything he says. And also it's just nice to see Nick Nolte work again. It's like, wow, the years have not been kind. But it's a great, and I remember when we watched that episode, I said, oh my God, this is my favorite episode of the series. Until we got to Escape from Shit Mountain, and it's like, okay, no, this is my favorite episode of the series. Mm-hmm. I love, and plus, oh, by the way, I think Joseph Gordon-Levitt, if I'm not mistaken, he's been involved or has some part of every single Rian Johnson movie. Obviously not TV show because he hasn't appeared in Breaking Bad or anything, but I think he's been in every movie that he's done. Even as he's even like the voice of the house in the Glass Onion movie, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, he's doing the bell. That's Joseph Gordon's voice.
Well, I don't think we mentioned this, and I think you and I both mentioned this before, and we would totally kick ourselves if we didn't mention it. Uh-oh. How much did we love that the hit song the drummer wrote was based on the music from Benson?
Oh, my gosh.
You want to talk about a love letter to the 70s, right? Like, of all the TV themes you could pick that were popular, Benson was a good theme, but it's not the one that would pop to the top of your mind. But I know when we watched it, you and I had talked about that, and we loved that the reason the band's ultimately denied a hit single is that it's copyright infringement, and the dude had watched Benson in the, while they're traveling down the road, and
which they hint at. I that was actually my favorite thing about that episode, because it was so beautiful and ridiculous all at the same time.
Yes.
The level of, I don't want to keep using words like meta, but maybe the fun references they do just from things that people are watching on TV. The fact that maybe I'm assuming it's Rian Johnson or someone else, but I'm going to say it's him because he wrote the episode we watched earlier today. Loves Burn Notice.
Yeah,
because I believe we see Burn Notice used more than a couple times on this, because it wasn't just this episode. We'd seen Burn Notice used before that. And if you want to talk about a reference, my friend, and this might be, forget all the other ones. Because yes, we know they reference movies. We saw the Hook movie, which is, whatever. I think Pulp Fiction's in another. I don't want to hear about any more TV references. Twice in this series. They did it tonight's episode, and they did it in another one. I don't remember which one. She's the one who makes it in the other one. And this one, it's the FBI agent who does it this time. Twice they make references, beautiful, I want to hug the people involved in this production references to the movie The Conversation. The Gene Hackman movie, The Conversation. Much like the movie I alluded to in the introduction but didn't say by title. By the way, Frank Galvin, I was referencing the movie The Verdict. If you haven't seen the movie The Conversation, please, please, please go out of your way to try to track that down and watch it. It is Gene Hackman's finest performance on film. I'm sorry, French Connection. I'm sorry, Unforgiven. You're both great, but The Conversation is his best performance on film. And I can make a case, I'll probably lose, but I can at least make a strong case for saying it's Coppola's best movie. Yes, that's right. I know The Godfather. I know. It probably those two are Godfather 1 and 2 are probably better. But I can try to make a case that Conversation is a better movie because The Conversation is watched coast to coast in film schools just as much as the Godfather movies. It's a brilliant movie. And it makes me sad that there's so many people who aren't even aware of it. I was watching a TV version of a radio show that I watch while I work during the day and sometimes one of the fellows on it does like a top 5 list. It's usually sports related, but every once in a blue moon he'll do a random TV or movie thing. He did a top 5 Gene Hackman thing for Gene Hackman's birthday a couple weeks ago. The Conversation was not in the top 5. I tweeted angrily at him. It's like, no, this list is fraudulent. You know, you can explain away not having the Royal Tenenbaums in there. You cannot explain away not having The Conversation in there. I am sorry. The Birdcage, really? Anyway, so
maybe he hadn't seen it.
So let's get to the finale.
Yes.
And I'm going to skip ahead to the end just for just to identify the voice because I think it's kind of funny the more I think about it. Because I think most people, if they watch the credits or they just recognize it outright, it's Rhea Perlman's voice. Not to be confused with Ron Perlman. You know? I'm pretty sure they're not related. Let me check. That means this series has not one but 2 different Cheers people who appear in episodes. Because John Ratzenberger is in, the second episode of the season. So I keep thinking, George Wendt was once on a Columbo. He can show up at some point, can't he? Where's Ted Danson? Come on. Anyway. Talk about an episode that you're watching and you're expecting it to go one way, and they keep zigging when we expect them to zag, and vice versa. It's no coincidence that whereas the previous episode was directed by Rian Johnson, this one was written by him. And I gotta be honest, I was very aware of that. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I noticed the level of, and the show is exceptionally well written throughout. So the 2 showrunners actually wrote the previous episode. But I felt the writing of this episode just got stepped up a notch. Characters were maybe even slightly more articulate and with the choice of words. Maybe he could use the word ruinous one less time. But other than that, I think that was like the theme of the episode. When more than one character uses the word ruinous, I think, wait a minute, maybe you should have changed that word. But there was so much, and I'll give you my favorite thing about one of my favorite things about the episode is we're watching this and it's the culmination of her having been on the run, that fantastic opening that shows us how much time has passed. Thank you, Rian Johnson. That's such a Rian Johnson kind of gag the way they pull that whole thing off, whatever. And there's so much fun of being on the run and all the things that happen there. And I won't tick them off because I want to give you stuff to say, obviously. But I'll tell you what I loved, which made me go, if this show isn't a top tier show, Mr. Brian, I know you like to say things aren't. I don't know what is. It's the conversation between her and her sister. Yeah. In the laundry room. There is so many obvious, I've seen this before, ways that scene could have been written and how and specifically Clea Duvall's dialogue could have been written. And that's not what they do. It's not, and how she talks about her is not how we expect her to talk about her. I'll ask anyone who watched that episode, think about what she says. Go back and rewatch those couple minutes and come back to me. Is that what you thought she was going to say to her? No. The only thing, yes, you knew she was going to make her leave, but you didn't think she was going to say those things to her. I love that. Because they've been having so much fun flipping on us as far as the murder mystery elements and all those kind of things. They just flipped that on us too.
They did, and they drop a big clue to their past, their shared past, that if you think back to Escape from Ship Mountain, when she thinks about maybe that was the happiest moment of my life, there's that scene at the pool with the creepy guy, and that's all you see of the past. And then her sister says this thing, And it makes you think, like I think the purpose of this scene is to say, even if there wasn't the turmoil that has her on the run, she's running from herself. Like she's always staying in motion because she can't find a home. She's on the move. Like she's running from her past. She's running from this, from that. And the great thing about that scene in my mind was there was enough compassion that her sister wasn't a complete ass, but there was not open arm acceptance or forgiveness, and pretty much said, like, maybe someday you can meet my daughter, but today's not the day, and you've got to do stuff differently. Like the life you live now, you want it. This is what you want. And I thought it was brilliant. And I thought it tied back to that scene in Escape from Shit Mountain. Yep. That like what you said, the economy of storytelling, like if you believe, if we want to be super cheesy and meta, it's usually a terrible thing that gives a person a superpower. It's usually not, unless you're Superman and you're born with it. Most superheroes are created. And, it may be at some point in the future we discover why she has to develop an ability to determine when people lie all the time. Mm-hmm. There's a hint that she has a pretty dark backstory. Yeah. It's done really well.
And just to continue with that, just for another moment or two, and then just maybe hit a few silly things about the episode before I wrap things up here. What I love about that, what you just said, and what I loved about the scene, and why I'm not, while I'm not saying this show is at that level as far as, it's like top 2, 3 of all time, kind of, obviously that's crazy. But I love that it's taking an idea, like say, I'll use Mad Men as an example, because I figure most of our listeners have actually watched Mad Men. And if they haven't, they should have. Think about Mad Men and think about how much or little we know about Don Draper throughout season 1, and how much we learn about him throughout season 1, and how more is trickled in on us throughout the next season and even the season after that. It takes us at least a few seasons to really get the full picture of who and what that character is. And he's also changing and or maybe he's actually not changing and evolving. That was his issue, actually. But you know what I'm saying? I love the fact that they're trickling in these things, and, they could have just made something really simple here and just said, and we're like, and you were abused as a child and you escaped and you left her there and whatever, but something that we've seen far too many times. I like that we got a sense, these things were said, but we know there's so much more to this story. We know there's more to this story because of the way that Charlie is acting and reacting. She's not trying to defend herself at all. So we know that she knows she was wrong. And that's very interesting.
And based on the rules of the show, her sister doesn't lie one single word.
Let me address that, because I want to correct me if I'm wrong, and I probably am often, because it happens. During this entire episode, the finale, and if it happened, just remind me. Does her bullshit meter ever go off? Because notice all the scenes of Benjamin Bratt, he never responds to her in a way where it's a lie, because he knows what she can do. Like that entire conversation on the yacht later, I noticed that. It's like, the way he's answering everything, that's why she's not tuned in. And in the car, same within the car. The Ron Perlman conversation, nothing he says is a lie. The conversation, there may have been a moment with the FBI agent, maybe, I don't remember, because she always has that reaction, always says bullshit. I don't remember her saying that throughout this episode.
I think if you remember, and I could be wrong, if I'm wrong, don't kill me, because the episode came out today and I've only watched it once, but I think he lies to her, but then hangs up and calls her on a separate phone that's a burner to tell her the truth. And I think that's when there's a mention of the conversation.
Okay,
Remember, like the initial time she calls him because she's calling, and I love that when it came back from commercial, I was like, "Is this another commercial?" And people are answering the phone, and you don't know who they are, and they hang up, and then
yeah, I got
and
confused
she's
too.
like, "Yeah," and she's like, "Well, I knew the last number had like a round thing in it," so she's
Right.
dialing the different numbers. She calls him. He tells her to hang up. He tells her to run. Hangs up, and then he calls her back. Now I say that I don't remember if she
But that,
reacted to anything he said.
that wouldn't be a lie though if he tells her to run. I don't know if that because that's a different type of statement. I don't know if that would because I don't remember her having a reaction to it.
I don't remember, but I'm saying if
but
it happened,
because I think that was a deliberate choice. I'm you know what? Until proven otherwise, or until I rewatch it. You know what? Between now and the next podcast, I will rewatch it because I'm curious. Because I think that might have been a very deliberate decision. It's like, hey, her superpower, she's not going to use it. It's not going to come into play in this episode. You know, it's kind of like it. You know, it's like, oh God, it's like this really annoying '80s movie I watched for a podcast I have to record tomorrow, which involves someone being a wolf. And in the final scene, it's like, and you know what? I bet he's not going to be the wolf in this whole scene because maybe they want to save on makeup. I don't know, and he wasn't. You know, why did I bring that up? Anyway, the only other things I want to mention about the episode, I love the twist of it, and you know the eventual what happens with the Benjamin Bratt character. I think is really kind of there's so much good that he does in this season, in this episode specifically. That really weird thing he does in the car with the lyrics, with with the hook, and because it goes on for a really long time. And that's when she gets. That's where he gets like a real reaction out of her about how he really is like a fucking horrible person or something. She says to him. I'm going that I'm trying to imagine the table read and them all cracking up that I can't believe you're making me do this whole thing. That's amazing.
And it goes on and on and on, and it's. And at first, I mean, I was like, I know these words from somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, what is it? And then, it gets to it. And it's sort of the theater of the absurd that he quotes like almost all the lyrics to the hook. And then you have a reference to the conversation. I mean, it brings together like, not to say that, Hook by Blues Traveler is, the least of art, but some people may not love it. It's more pop art, but conversation is, fine art. But to bring together these big elements that are that far apart, really, really, really creative. And I guess if since we're sort of starting to wrap up, I think the last thing I'd like to say that I really liked about this show is, this is, well, you could talk about that, but I like that a lot of the action is sort of in small town, out of the way places. It's not in big cities. Like she's intentionally going to like small little places, sort of off the grid, and you're sort of seeing cinematography and depictions of places that you don't see in a lot of TV shows now. Like it's like you might see Jim Rockford jump in his car and drive out of town to do an investigation and be out, somewhere in a trailer park or something. But this show is sort of centered in, I don't want to say rural, but let's just say maybe a more, some of the more forgotten parts of America and some of the more distant off the grid places. And I really like that. I like that Shit Mountain is sort of established as a community into itself, that the second episode, that sort of town is a place unto itself. And, so I really like that as a device for the way they tell the stories. And so, this is a show I was excited about. but it far exceeded my expectations. It definitely is top tier TV, Scott. Just so you know. But loved it. Hope the listeners loved it. If you have feedback, please send us feedback about what you thought, any ideas, theories you had. But I absolutely loved it, and I really enjoyed talking about it.
Absolutely. The thing with the more out of the way locations, I for me that just goes back to one of the conceits of the show that they're basically lifting the idea of the person on the run trying to stay off the grid kind of thing.
Right.
Even though nowadays staying off the grid is more referencing, the internet and whatever. But this goes back to the two shows I mentioned specifically. And I say that because if I'm not mistaken, Rand Johnson himself has actually referred to those two shows specifically, The Fugitive and what was a version of The Fugitive 10 years later, The Incredible Hulk, except for when you get to the final episode of The Fugitive, because I've actually seen it all. Thank you, A&E, back in the early 90s. It was always little small, rural, weird little towns and whatever. He wasn't going like, oh, and now I'm in Chicago, and now I'm in, New York. No, he was never in New York. Although part of me thinks, he could have probably gotten lost in New York. I love the reset at the end of the episode. Like, oh, okay, now we know what the through line is going to be for the next season. Where, as the Rail Perlman character, Beatrix Hasp says, it's not just the one guy in pursuit of her who actually had a special, affection for her. It's the 5 families. We're all modern and we're going to kill whatever. And I love that she doesn't go along with the deal, of course, because then you really wouldn't have a show. Okay, I made a joke to you. I pantomimed to you because we watch each other on a video screen as we record the podcast here. The dick ring was making me laugh because I loved it's on her finger, it's off her finger. Oh my gosh, it got back on her finger again.
Yeah.
That's such a great gag. And the fact that that's what pokes him in the eye at the end. It's like, if you had told me, if we're watching the very first episode, I was like, hey, how she's going to catch him? She's going to stick a plastic dick in his eye.
Yeah.
You probably would, like, wait, what? No. Brilliant storytelling, lovely performances. My opinion about Natasha Lyonne has changed dramatically. I did like Russian Doll, although I think the second season is a bit much, and I don't think it's as good as the first season. And I start to get really weary of Natasha Lyonne. She reminds me of any number of people I could have been friends with back in the day, back when I would hang out in Manhattan more often, quite frankly. But she's really won me over in such a big way with this series and her performance in it. And by the way, the fact that she I noticed very, very subtly that she went from, either cigarettes or the occasional vape to something which is like, I don't know if it was like a little mini cigar, like almost like a cheroot for a while there towards the end, which made me go, oh, now you're really getting into the Columbo of it because he had a cigar, not cigarette. Someone said, oh, he's always smoking cigarettes. Like, no. Columbo smoked a cigar. He didn't smoke cigarettes. Anyway, let's end it there because we went a little longer than I expected, but I realized we loved Poker Face so much it was an entire season. It deserved it. I think, looking back, we might actually have this podcast. It might be nice. It might be like the first hour is Perry Mason, second hour is Poker Face. I'm good with that. And hopefully you guys were good with it. And if you enjoyed this podcast, guess what? You'll also enjoy hanging out on our Facebook page, which is the Serious TV Drama Podcast page, where you can like the page and join the conversation about shows like Poker Face and Perry Mason. And that's where you can give us feedback or leave comments throughout the week about shows like Perry Mason. And if you say something which is really kind of interesting, maybe one of us will bring it up. Do I think that'll happen? Probably won't. But, we're putting it out there. We wouldn't mind. It would be kind of cool, kind of different. Anyway, you can find this podcast on any number of podcast platforms. Guess what? You can also find that other one I do called Scott Forgot the 80s. That's on every podcast platform because I actually care about that one. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, but if you want to just find everything, just go to podbean.com. If you type in Scott Forgot, you'll find the other one. If you type in Serious TV Drama, you'll find this one. And if you find this one, you can find Good Lord. 370 episodes of this crap. There's actually like 20 or 30 good ones. Beyond that, you can follow us on Instagram. I recently actually put a bunch of pictures there because I hadn't done it since October. On Instagram, we're known as Serious TV Drama is one word. On Twitter, you can follow us at STVD Podcast. STVD as in Serious TV Drama. We will be back next week with the latest episode of Perry Mason. And I might as well just say it on the podcast because I have a firm commitment we're going to do this. Later this month, this podcast will again expand to cover another series, but it's going to be a series that's going to be moving forward also in its final season. And that series is, I'm so excited, we're going to be talking about Succession. That's right. Every podcast, every week, you're going to get Perry Mason and we're going to get Succession. I don't know which one we're going to talk about first. Maybe we'll switch it from week to week. Who knows? Actually, I think I know which one we're going to talk about first, but we'll see. Anyway, so that's something to look forward to. For those of you who watch both shows, oh, it's such a treat. And for those of you who only watch one or the other, you know what? You should watch both. Otherwise, just figure out which one to listen to and then ignore the rest. I don't know. So, maybe we'll flip a coin or a poker chip like what Detective Holcomb does to figure out which one we'll do. Okay, with all that said, Brian, it was great being able to hang out on a podcast with you once again and see your smiling, not so cherubic face over there. So I was going to say, I was going to try to, because I've come up with such a nice way to end the Scott Forgot the 80s podcast. By the way, if you can look for it. Just remember Scott spelled it 1 T. Anyway, just put Scott Forgot. You'll find it everywhere. But I was going to come up with a tagline to end the Perry Mason podcast. I was going, the defense rests or court is adjourned. Or then I realized, hey, trying too hard, bro.
Well, just remember, if Charlie shows up in your town, you're in trouble.
Oh, I'm in such trouble.
And if Scott keeps talking about Scott Forgot the 80s and me being the long lost stepson, I might be the Little Ray Howery character. There might be a Charlie in our future. So,
okay, with that I got to figure. Wait, it took almost 2 hours for me to figure out something I'm going to edit out of the podcast. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, it was great having you here. Great being able to talk about Perry Mason again, and great to finally get to talk about Poker Face as well. I think this was as entertaining as fuck all, and I hope everyone enjoys it. Till next time, we'll see you later.
See ya.